One of my favorite things in the world to do is watch Friends. I know it's been off for years and years. It's not even around, but I still find myself binge watching old episodes. And I was thinking about this today and thinking, it's the predictability of the friends in the circle, right? You have Chandler with his quirkiness, Monica with her type A of just everything has to be so neat and tidy and organized. It's Phoebe's ability to make you laugh at her silly songs. Ross always comes in with those smart comments, and Joey and him and his food, like it is just so hilarious. And of course, Rachel, she just brings everybody together, and it's just such this beautiful, cohesive team of people. And it's why I wanted to come on and share with you today that I have an opportunity for you to find your friends in the content creation space. So if you are thinking about creating your first or your next digital course, I don't want you to miss this opportunity because Amy Porterfield just opened the doors for registration for her Course Confident Bootcamp. And I'm actually offering a special bonus for anyone that registers for the Course Confident Bootcamp through my special link. So I want you to go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register. That's crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And what you're going to find when you get there is I have this special bonus private podcast series. It's called Money Mindset for Creators. So I want you to go register for Amy's Bootcamp, download the podcast, and immediately start listening to it, because what this training is set up to do is to help you get your mind right about monetizing your content, making money so that you can fuel your content creation dreams. So go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp to register for Course Confident. And I cannot wait for you to find your friends and find the people that will be there for you. Do you see what I did there? Yeah, nice little friends segue connection. Go to crystalprofit.com/Amy-bootcamp. And I cannot wait to see you inside. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Okay, I don't know if you've realized this about me, but I am an ever learner. Is that a thing? Did I just make something up? Is that totally not a phrase that people use? Like, I'm constantly learning new things. Like, I'm not afraid to try new things, and I'm not afraid to like kind of think outside the box and really just watch what other people are doing. And so today's episode is very heavily centered on what I've seen recently with limited series podcast. So if you've been thinking like, what is that? I've heard of that before, but I'm not really sure what that is. Is this something I should be thinking about? Like, should I have my first podcast be a limited series podcast? Or should I have my next podcast be a limited series podcast? This is what we're talking about today. So let's get right to it. Welcome to the Profit Podcast, where we teach entrepreneurs how to start, launch, and market their podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Profit, and I'm so excited that you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me today, because if you've been trying to figure out the world of podcasting, think of this show as the time-saving shortcut you've been looking for. So let's get right to it, shall we? All right, so like I said in the beginning, we are talking about a limited series podcast today. And I'm just going to like give you, here's where we're going today. Here's like the whole rundown of what you're going to experience in today's episode. I'm going to tell you what that is and what I'm actually talking about. And then I am going to give you some examples of limited series podcasts that I have actually listened to. So it's not just in theory, like, oh, this is what it could be. I'm going to give you some actual examples that you can go check out and listen to. And then I'm going to give you some questions to help you decide, do I need to have a limited series podcast? Okay, so that's where we're going. So let's start off with what the heck is a limited series podcast? Okay, so This actually came across my plate, if you want to call it. That's not right. It came across my desk. That's not right either. It came across my headphones. Let's call it that, right? So the very first limited series podcast I ever listened to was in 2016-ish. That's what I'm thinking. 2015, I think it would have been 2016. So if you've listened to this podcast before, you know I am a huge fan of Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic. Like, I don't say this lightly. That book changed my life. And I am not a rereader of books, but I have listened to that audiobook, and I'm not exaggerating whatsoever. I've listened to it a minimum of 6 times. Okay, I don't reread books, y'all. That is not my thing. I'm just happy if I finish an entire book cover to cover in a relatively short amount of time. And what by that I mean between 30 and 60 days. I'm not a fast reader. I don't have a lot of time to sit down and read books unless I'm on vacation, and I just don't do a ton of reading. But that audiobook, there's something about it. And I actually have never even read the physical copy of that book. I don't own a physical copy of that book. But that audiobook has been my go-to time and time again anytime I feel creatively stuck. Yes, so it came out, I think it came out in 2016 is when the book was actually published. And that was just so happened to be right in the middle of my creative journey. I had started writing and I was trying to figure out, do I want to blog? Do I want to do this? Do I want to be a writer? Do I want to do that? I was in this kind of zone of trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do and what that looked like. And so she wrote this book. I listened to the audiobook. This was back when I was really big into taking my kids to the library. We'd always go to the library and I would check out books, and we were part of they call it a consortium, which I'd never heard that word before. I will not sit here. I've told y'all, discombobulated is my big word that I like to use. Other than that, I don't like to use a whole bunch of big words. It's just not my thing. I have a very low level vocabulary. It's just how I roll. I think that really big words make you sound elitist, and I just don't like to use big words. But consortium, the library consortium, I had no idea what that was. And it is a place for you to check out books online. You can do audiobooks, you can do ebooks. And so when we were, I was staying at home at the time. I was not working. I didn't have an online business. I was trying to figure things out. I would listen to audiobooks. And I came across Big Magic, right? I got to check it out. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. So good. And whenever it was finished, I didn't want it to stop. I was like, this is so good. I felt like she was coaching me through my creative journey. And I just wanted more. And then I found out about magic lessons. So magic lessons, if you don't understand the concept of big magic, don't worry. There's no sorcery or witchery or anything like that involved in it. It's all about the process of creative thinking and living, and how ideas are constantly coming to us. And it's our decision whether we do something with those creative ideas or we just let them pass us by. So the magic lessons are directly correlated to how people have implemented the strategies in the book, or how they had a creative experience after reading the book, or just having a conversation with Elizabeth Gilbert, the author. So it is a limited series podcast. And y'all, this was published in 2016. The very first episode was published July 2016. And let me see if I can count how many there are. There's 12 in what she's calling first season. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in the next one. So there's 22 episodes that are roughly, I would say most of them are between 60 minutes And oh no, some of them are shorter. Some of them are 20 minutes. Some of them are 20 minutes. And then the second season, it looks like they're going into 60 to 75 minutes. So why does this matter? Like what does this even mean? Well, for one, she published this in 2016, and I actually looked it up on Chartable, and she is still charting. She has not published anything in 5 years of this podcast, but I'm looking at the charts right now, and in the United States, under the arts category, this is the number 32 podcast. She's in the top 50 podcast, and she has not published anything in 5 years. Y'all, this blows my mind. It's so interesting to me. Maybe I'm the only like nerd that wants to know all these things, but it's so fascinating. And so what she's done, like I said, she's taken like real small chunks or the lessons. Again, it's called magic lessons. She's taken pieces of it and said, okay, how can we apply this to what's going on in our lives? Or how can we take this one story, this one concept, this one topic from the book and tell a story about it or interview someone about it? So super, super interesting. So this is like example number one. I told you I was going to say what a limited series podcast is. This is one example. Okay. Like, so don't think that it's like a black and white, it can only be one thing. This is the example I wanted to share with you first that had to do with an author and how she did this 5 years ago. It's still blowing my mind. She did it 5 years ago and it's still there. It's still ranking. It's still super cool. So anybody that is an author, you want to be an author one day and you want to have kind of like the next steps to go with your audience. Don't feel like you have to start a podcast and then continue doing it. And that's the only thing that you can talk about forever and ever, because she is a living, breathing example of she has a podcast that's still out there running and it is still continuously doing very, very well. So that is the first version or the first concept example of an audio podcast, a limited series podcast. Now, the next one is a more recent example, and it's one that does kind of fit more into a box of if you wanted to do a limited series podcast, this one has certain formatting around it that is more, duplicatable. Like I'm trying to say duplicatable. Is that a word? No, I'm just making up words. Replicatable. You want to replicate it? Duplicatable, replicatable. Y'all know. I just make up words. I don't even know. I'm not even going to look it up. I'm just going to say that's a word. That's what we're going to say about this. But the formatting of this podcast can absolutely be redone. You can replicate this. So Amy Porterfield recently did the Talking Body podcast. And this was a limited series, only 12 episodes. I don't remember exactly when it started. Did it start in January? I'm going to have to look this up now. Hang on. We are going to look this up because I'm so curious when she started this, because I know she just released the last and like the 12th episode, and it was kind of like in the air whether it's going to be a season 2 or if it's just going to be like a one season, like a one-hit wonder. I'm not really sure. So that's another thing is if you want to start a podcast, right? Like I've talked on here before about seasons. I'm not a huge fan of seasons. Anything you listen to, like this is episode 245 of the Profit Podcast. We've never done seasons on this show. But if you wanted to do seasons, doing a limited series podcast can absolutely allow for you to do that because it is like you're only releasing a certain number of episodes. Okay, so Talking Body with Amy Porterfield. What is this about? Why did she do this? Why did she create a brand new podcast? Well, if you have ever listened to any of her other podcasts, it's Online Marketing Made Easy. And she's been doing that for several years. And it's all about, building a digital course business. And it's about email marketing and a lot of things that have to do with running an online business. This podcast, Talking Body, has nothing to do with any of that. Nothing at all. So this podcast is about women and their issues with their body or their kind of viewpoint, their perspective of their body, and looking at it from a different angle. Or she brought experts on the show. I actually listened to every single episode, and it was just totally different than what she does on her other podcast. It was produced differently. There was actual like a production team. Whereas on her regular show, it's usually her just talking, and she has like some music with like her podcast main theme, or she has a guest on the show, and there's not a whole bunch of production. Like there's not sound effects, there's not music, there's not clips of other people talking. Like they had a lot of production going into this podcast. And I don't know if they were like, hey, let's just really beef up the production, knowing that it was only going to be for a short period of time. And because I've watched Amy from afar for a long time, I know that she batches her content. So she was probably able to batch 2 or 3 episodes in a sitting. And if you're only doing 12 episodes, that's only, between 4 and 6 batching sessions. Like that's really is probably a lot like easier on your calendar than the commitment of podcasting every single week. Okay, so those are my examples of what a limited series podcast can be. But again, you're like, well, can this work for me? Like, is this something that I need to consider? Like, is this something that I should look at? Or I'm releasing a book, I'm doing an event, I have something that's very different from what I'm doing right now. Should I start a different podcast? This is where I believe a limited series podcast can come into play without you making the commitment of an entire new show. So if you've been around here for a while, you know that I have this podcast. I have the Profit Podcast. I also have the Potty Report. That is my daily podcast. That is Monday through Friday, 5 minutes or less, and it publishes every single week. And we actually just hit a year of that podcast, and we're at, I think it was like 270 episodes. Like it's crazy. It's crazy. Like a daily podcast, like you will get up there in the episode numbers super quick whenever you're publishing every single day. But I wanted to have a separate podcast, the daily one, so I could really just share more. It's kind of like a day in the life of a podcaster. I share behind the scenes, I share stories, I share strategies of what I'm actually doing in my business, in my podcast. But that doesn't need to be a limited series because that is ongoing. So that is why that is a daily podcast and not just a limited series podcast. However, if you've listened to this show, you know that I released a book last year. I launched Start a Binge-Worthy Podcast. It's my book. You should go check it out. Thebestpodcastbook.com. You're going to find a link in the show notes for all the things. But I launched my book last year, and I thought, should I release this as a book for sale on Audible, or should I release it as a limited series podcast?
Being a woman in business comes with its own unique set of challenges, but also so many opportunities. We get ahead by leaning in to what makes us different from business as usual. I'm Samantha Hartley, host of Profitable Joyful Consulting, inviting you to a special 6-episode series exploring the experience of being a woman in business. You want to hear from women consultants who've hit $1 million, who sell 6-figure engagements, or who've broken their own revenue ceilings? Yeah, those are my clients, and they'll be sharing too. Join me for 6 must-listen episodes that tackle key challenges for women consultants.
Follow Profitable Joyful Consulting on your favorite podcast app.
And the verdict is still out, honestly, because I've had issues with getting it uploaded to Audible. There was a lot of that's a whole other conversation for another day. Like the things that I've learned in creating an Audible or an audiobook. But I still kind of have a feeling I may turn that into a limited series podcast where I'm not adding on to it. There's not production. There's nothing crazy going on. It's just, this is the audiobook. Here it is. You can go listen to it, and I could release it that way. And I've had people say, oh, well, what about, what if they bought your book and they're like, all of a sudden you're going to give them access to your limited series podcast? Well, there's definitely certain ways you can only get access to it by, purchasing this, or, there's all kinds of ways that you can put your content behind a paywall. But I think it's so interesting that if you want to release a book, you can release, much like Elizabeth Gilbert did, some sort of supportive content for whenever someone finishes your book and they're like, oh, now what? Now what should I do? Is there more? And maybe your more is your product or your service or something along those lines, but it could also be a podcast, because I don't know if y'all know this or you think about podcasting in a higher level strategy, but I'm going to zoom out for a second. Looking at the Profit Podcast, like I said, we're on episode 245. If you're just now joining us and you have not listened to this podcast before, there's a good chance you're going to go into our backlog and listen to some of the episodes that we have there. Because this is what people do when they find a podcast. I know I do it. I know my friends do it. I know my mom does it. Like, if you find a podcast, you really click with someone immediately. You're like, oh, what else do they have? I want to go listen to their previous stuff and see, because I bet it, I get her personality. I like them. I think they're funny. I think they're entertaining. I think they're motivating. Whatever reason you have behind listening to a podcast, you're likely going to go into their backlog and see what else do they have. So you could actually monetize what people are going back into your backlog and listening to. So if you release, I'm sure Elizabeth Gilbert has found a way to monetize her magic lessons. Otherwise, why would she still have them there, right? I think that she is either using that to direct traffic, back to her website, back to somewhere else, or maybe even to her next book. But there's a reason why it's still there. And I think that part of it is either of monetary value or to get people to join her on another platform somewhere. Okay, so that's like the big picture, zooming out of what a limited series podcast can look like whenever you get started. But I want to go into when you should consider doing a limited series podcast. So number one, is the topic you're thinking about talking about totally unrelated to what you do now? So that goes back to the example of Amy having the Talking Body podcast. It was totally different. If she would have released those episodes on her Online Marketing Made Easy show, it wouldn't have resonated. It may have even fallen flat because people are like, what is this about? I don't care. Maybe they're men, men that listen to her show and they're like, I'm not a woman. I don't have body issues. I was here for your marketing techniques and I was here for this and I'm just going to go somewhere else now. So it's really about staying hyper-focused on one topic on each podcast. So again, this goes back to reiterating, you don't have to look at, well, I really want to talk about something else. Should I start a whole other podcast and commit to publishing every single week? No, you don't. You have the option of a limited series podcast where maybe you could just publish 5 episodes. Maybe you want to commit to doing 20 episodes and then you're like, okay, we're going to reevaluate after season 1 and see if this is something we want to continue doing for our listeners or if we're just done and we want to, be done with it. So that's number 1. Is it totally unrelated to what you're talking about now? The second thing to consider is it hyper-focused on one piece of content or an event? This goes back to Elizabeth Gilbert's magic lesson. Is it hyper-focused on a book or on an event or something that you're like, it is so just like I have a podcast or I have other content that I talk about, but I want to get really, really focused on this one thing, this one avenue, this one strategy. Here's another example. I've had many people come to me and say, you should talk about email marketing. You should. You write awesome emails, like you explain it really well whenever you do it, But for me, I don't like talking about email marketing on this podcast. I've actually talked about it a lot on the Potty Report. I've talked about strategies, I've talked about things because that podcast has that format where I can talk about it more there. But this show, I want it to be about podcasting. That is exactly what I want it to be about. So who knows? Maybe I'll start another podcast on email marketing or about writing great emails or something. I don't know. But I want you to be hyper focused on one topic, one piece of content, a book, a course, event, whatever it is, fill in the blank, right? And the third one, this is your last consideration. If you're thinking about, should I do a limited series podcast? If you're thinking about testing out a new idea for a show. So this goes back to what we were talking about. Like if you're like playing with the idea, should I have a second podcast? And you would be surprised. Like if you're just now getting into the podcasting game and you're just listening to this, you're like, okay, I'm just a sponge right now. I'm soaking everything up. I'm trying to decide what I want to do. You would be so surprised once someone starts a podcast in their first 3 to 6 months, they come to me and say, I think I want to start another podcast. And I don't know like what they're expecting my reaction to be. If they're expecting me to say, no, that's a terrible idea. Or, oh, that's a fantastic idea. I don't really know what reaction they're expecting from me. But at the end of the day, I'm going to tell you, you do what you can manage. You do what works for your personal lifestyle, your professional lifestyle, and like what will help you keep your sanity for sure. But if you just want to test out new ideas, a limited series podcast, like setting it up that way with the expectation that I don't really know if we're going to do this forever and ever, but committing to at least 10 episodes or 5 episodes or 3 episodes or whatever, like whatever number, but you've got to commit to something, right? I'm very big on commitment and like, yeah, you can get started with something, but what is your end goal? If it's not to keep podcasting forever and ever, you're just like, I think I want to try this out. I'm not 100% confident that it's going to work. I'm not 100% confident that I'm going to love it. Like whatever your reason is, then maybe a limited series podcast could work for you until you figure out, I want to go all in on this, or maybe this was a terrible idea, right? That's usually what happens is like, oh my gosh, this was a terrible idea. It took up way too much of my time. It wasn't worth the effort, whatever it is. So those are the things that I want you to consider whenever you are thinking about doing a limited series podcast. But I want to give a shout out to a platform that I recently found that I think is really cool, and that is Hello Audio. I'm not an affiliate of them. They don't sponsor this show, but I've been really impressed because I recently used them inside a membership that I was a part of. So I joined this membership, and one of the perks that they were advertising is like, we get this private podcast feed. And I was like, oh, this sounds interesting. You know, I almost want to join the membership. Had nothing to do with podcasting, this membership. But I was like, oh, well, this sounds interesting. I want to see how this works. So basically, I, subscribe to this podcast by clicking a link in an email, and then it sends me to this podcast. It's a private feed, and I can click subscribe. And then anytime a new episode is uploaded, then I automatically get it on Apple Podcasts. Now, it is limited to Apple Podcast. I don't know that you can listen on Spotify, Google Podcast, or someone else. So that may not be for you if you are like, I don't use any Apple products. This is not for me. My audience doesn't use Apple products. Like, I get it. But I love the concept of these membership platforms where, I've seen these. They've been around. This isn't anything new, but it's the first time I've used one as a consumer. And I gotta say, I'm here for it. I think it was really cool. And if you wanted to do a limited series, I'll just go ahead and tell you what it was. So it was Emily Hirsch's Not for Lazy Marketers. It was all about Facebook ads. And the reason why I bring that up is because what she was also doing, like we had our own private feed, but she was also in a promotional period where she partnered with Hello Audio, and they did a limited series podcast for her promotion. This was so cool. I'd never seen this before, and I devoured like all the episodes in, I think, like it was over spring break. So I was driving. My parents live 4.5 hours away from me. So I devoured all the episodes on the way there. And I thought this was so genius. So if you're thinking about launching something in the future and you're like, oh, I want to put these episodes out, but then I want to take them down. It almost has the same kind of like you're thinking about, should I do a webinar or should I do something where I'm doing email marketing or anything like that? A podcast that's very limited, that is only going to be up from this date to this date, could be really cool. So I'm going to drop the links to everything that we're talking about here today. So crystalprofit.com/episode 245, but that's all I have for you today. So I hope that you learn more about Limited Series Podcast. I hope that this piqued your interest and you're like, that could be something that maybe I'd be interested in, or maybe you are just interested in learning more. Post about it. Come join us in our free Facebook group, the Profit Podcast Online Community. You will find a link in the show notes, but that's all I have for you today. If this is your first time tuning in and you're not subscribed to this show, what are you doing? Okay, what are you doing? If you're going to hang out with us, just commit, go all in, hit subscribe so you get a notification every Tuesday and Thursday whenever a new episode drops. But that's all I have for you today. So remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere. Hey, Profit Podcast listeners. Thanks for sticking around to a little bit after the episode to hear this special message, because I want to hear from you. We are starting a new segment called Fan Mail Shoutouts, and I want to hear from you, and I want to hear your questions. What do you want to know? What questions have you been dying to ask me? So here's how to make this happen. Go to the app where you're listening to this podcast right now. Go there. I'll wait a second. Okay. Now, once you're there, you're going to see a hyperlink at the top of the episode description that says, send Crystal a text message. And that's all I want you to do. Send me a text. It could be casual, informal. It could be totally anonymous. Or if you want, you can include your name and the name of your podcast or content wherever you are creating, and I will give you a special shout out in an upcoming episode. So again, go to the show notes for where you're listening to this episode right now, and it will say, send Crystal a text message. And I cannot wait to hear from you and give you a shout out in an upcoming segment of Fan Mail Shoutouts.